My name is Tom Harris, and this is Exploratory Journeys. My co-host today is Joseph Benamy, who, of course, is the producer of the show and, of course, of his own show, The Joe and Nick Show. Or is it The Nick and Joe Show? I always mix it up.
It's funny because it's The Nick and Joe Show, but last night it was just The Joe Show.
The Joe Show.
It was The Joe Show, right.
Yeah.
So, but, of course, I introduced it because Nick was off at a previous engagement. First time in 171 episodes.
Whoa.
We've been doing now, it's 4 years we've been doing the show. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I said. It was the Nick and Joe Show. And we have this kind of introduction where I go, I'm Joe, he's Nick, and you're listening to the Nick and Joe Show. And then I had to stop and say, well, actually, I'm fibbing. He's not Nick because he's not here at all.
Right? So you use a different voice or something. Well, today we're going to talk about the influence of China, in particular the Communist Party of China, on the Western world. And I wanted to start out, Joseph, with the climate scare, because it's enormously to China's benefit that the climate scare continue, because not only are they the world's largest supplier of wind and solar power, which of course Western governments say is going to stop climate change, but they also have no limits. And this is something most people don't realize. Most people think that, well, under the Paris Agreement, you've got to 2030, and then China has to stabilize their emissions. But what they don't realize is that the underlying treaty, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, gives China an out clause. And Joseph, you'd laugh to hear what the Chinese delegate said at the Peru Conference of the Parties in 2014, when a reporter cornered him and asked if they would be prepared to actually amend the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Do you remember what he said?
Something along the lines of, no, that's not going to happen.
Essentially.
He probably framed it, a little bit more, a little less harsh than that. But essentially, that's the answer. No.
Well, that's right. He said the purpose of the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, which was what was coming up the next year, is to enforce the Framework Convention, not to change it. And the reason is, of course, they know they have a sweetheart deal, because the sweetheart deal is this. In the Framework Convention, which underlies all UN climate treaties, it says specifically that developing country parties, their first and overriding priority is poverty alleviation and development.
Right.
Right. So they're not going to turn off their cheapest form of power for the sake of greenhouse gas emissions. So the fact is, sure, come 2030, they're going to just continue to increase emissions indefinitely. And they know that they've got an out clause, something that developed countries don't have.
And it's more than that. I mean, we tend, Tom, to look at these international treaties and treat them as if they're, biblical in nature, okay? Like they're inviolable. The truth is that a government like the Chinese Communist government could sign any agreement that they want to. Whether or not they're going to stick to the agreement or not is anyone's guess. And all we have to do is look at the commitments that we here in Canada, and we're not unique, by the way, other countries around the world make many, many commitments on this climate change. They've made many commitments and other areas of public policy that they don't actually follow through on. So it's not just a question of whether or not China is going to join the countries who are making commitments. It's whether or not, having made a commitment, and I don't think they will, and in that respect, they're being more honest in a sense
than we are.
Yeah. Okay. But even if they did make that commitment, I would have no confidence that they would follow through and meet those commitments.
Mm-hmm. Well, we interviewed a China expert last week on America Out Loud, Rich Kozlovich, and he was saying that you can't trust China to fulfill any international agreements because they simply ignore them. They're claiming areas in the South China Sea that international agreements show that are not theirs, but they're just saying they take them anyway. So they simply do whatever they want, and if you don't like it, tough. So I don't think we can trust them And even if we could, they've got an out clause, and this is something that Trudeau and company, they say they're going to lead the world to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Well, the world's not following.
Well, that's just hubris on the part of our government here in Canada and other Western governments as well. Mm-hmm. But look, how do I put this delicately? The good news is that I am not convinced, and let me say, as I want to point out right from the word go, that I'm not an expert in the field. I don't consider myself to be a scientist. I consider myself to be an educated layperson. And so I'm more apt to ask questions, and I'm going to be bothered not so much by the answers, but rather the not getting answers. Mm-hmm. And so this has always been sort of my approach to climate change and the climate scare. It's always been that I hear a lot of theories, okay, and as I say, as an educated layperson, they provoke certain questions in my mind. Certain things don't quite fit, don't quite make sense. So I'll ask those questions, and typically the response is going to be, "Oh, you're a climate change denier."
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that would be probably the most gentle ad hominem attack that I would be subjected to. And as you know, you've been in this business for a long time, Tom, so colleagues of yours who have actually had death threats.
Oh, yeah.
Serious death threats that the police have had to come in, not just to investigate, but actually provide security and what have you. Okay, so if the science is settled, if it's unequivocal, which, is
a stupid term.
Well, I was talking about the latest report from I called it on my show the International. It's the Intergovernmental
Panel on Climate Change.
And I played a clip from the CBC reporting on it. And the reporter calls it grim reading.
Oh, yeah.
And afterwards I pointed out, because one of the criticisms that people level at me is that I'm excessively pedantic. So I said, well, it really was grim reading when you look at the kind of language that they're using, that in fact isn't even applicable. Mm-hmm. And, it's unequivocal is one of the words that's out there. And I do have a question for you. I know I'm starting to ramble on a little bit, but and I know we don't want to necessarily talk at length about climate change itself, but while we're on the topic, Tom, I have asked several people in the last 24 hours what exactly an extreme sea level rise event is. Because I having been in the Navy, mm-hmm. I've been in more than one or two extreme sea events.
Yeah.
Okay. Which is exciting in and of itself. But I'm not really sure what an extreme sea level event is. And so they were talking about how, New
York is going to flood or whatever. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. It just made it sound like, okay, you can have a storm. So mm-hmm. you have erosion. You'll have, I don't know, like the tide is going to change all this. I mean, I don't really know. What do you mean an extreme sea level rise event?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what they're talking about is a repeat of what happened 8,000 years ago. 8,000 years ago, sea level was rising on average about 10 times faster than today. And nowhere on Earth is it rising more than 10 inches per century right now. So this is very modest, very moderate. And it's been happening since the end of the last glacial, 15,000 years ago. So the bottom line is they're saying that we're going to return to those extremely high sea level rise rates, which indeed were a problem, and settlements that were near the coast would have to move, so there was no question about it. But, one of the things the UN, and I want to talk a little more about this use of the word unequivocal.
Right.
In the main report, there are 33 times where they use the word unequivocal. Now, that is ridiculous. In fact, even people on the left are saying that's ridiculous. I mean, Stephen Goldman from Lehigh University in Chicago, for example, he supports the climate scare, but at the same time, he says, no, he says observations are never unequivocal, or the interpretation of them. So there's two mistakes, actually. They say the observed average sea level and temperature rise indicates unequivocally, these are approximate words, that humans are the major driver. Well, first of all, you don't observe average anything. You don't observe average sea level or average temperature. You observe individual thousands of measurements around the world, and you average it. So that's a mistake right there, the first part. The second part is wrong because unequivocal means there can be no other possible explanation. It is true in the Platonic sense. Plato said that truth was universal, necessary, and certain. It applied everywhere, universal. It had to be the way it was. 2 + 2 = 4. It has to be that way. And it's certain. There's no uncertainty, 100% certain. And, in contrast, observations philosophers have always recognized are the opposite of universal, necessary, and certain. They're very particular to locations. They're contingent, they're uncertain. And so, in fact, he actually, as a left-wing philosopher who supports the climate scare, says that the UN statements, it's impossible.
Well, it's not just impossible the way that you've described it, but unequivocal means that you can't equivocate. Okay, people equivocate, not facts. Facts are not equivocal or unequivocal.
Yeah.
Okay, they just are. Mm-hmm. So I'm really not sure what it is that they're trying to say when they say they're unequivocal.
Mm-hmm. Well, they're trying to say nobody can debate it, so shut up.
So call it indisputable, call it incontrovertible, call it anything, but don't say that it's unequivocal.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Because it's the word simply doesn't apply in the context that they're using it.
Well,
but as I said, sometimes I get into these things and I'll go, at the risk of sounding excessively pedantic, blah 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 blah, right?
But these are supposedly the most important climate reports in the world. So you'd think that they would have somebody vetting it from that point of view. I mean, they do use the words indisputable. They do use that word as well. Right. They say exactly this. They say the human influence is indisputable. Well, no, there's lots of people disputing it, the degree to which it's significant.
Well, and that just brings me back to the whole issue that I have, and that is, Tom, I know enough science, I know enough I know enough geography, I know enough physics, I know enough chemistry, where I listen to what they're saying, and I'm going, okay, that doesn't quite add up to me based on the basic knowledge that I have. So please elaborate. Mm-hmm. Please explain yourself. Show me the connections, okay? We're talking about cause and effect here. Mm-hmm. So we should be able to connect the dots.
Not necessarily. This is postmodern thinking.
Well, and I invariably, okay, it's not most of the time they don't connect the dots for me. They never do. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, and I was pointing this out to somebody over lunch today, we were having a discussion around it. I've been in the public policy field in one form or another for, close to 3 decades now. And I've met with people on both sides of the climate change debate. And I've heard the case made. Mm-hmm. And I have to tell you that the case against man-made climate change is very compelling. Mm-hmm. And so, as I say, I've gone back to some of these other people and I've said, well, okay, what about this and this and this and this? And invariably, without exception, I not only do I not get an answer, but in most cases, I'll get, ad hominem attacks.
Yeah, you're a climate change denier.
Well,
no, I'm a questioner, and that's normal.
But how do you deal with the hysteria? Mm-hmm. I mean, this isn't even a scientific issue anymore. It's a question of, the mob has gotten riled up, and in a democracy, the mob rules, mm-hmm. like it or not. Mm-hmm. So how do you deal with it? How do you get people to just chill out, calm down, and let's take a rational, calm, sensible look at this stuff? Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, you can't. And it's all of this is very apropos because we're living in a strange time. Mm-hmm. We have the latest report where we're just coming out of the COVID pandemic, hopefully, where it just seemed that every decision that governments were making were were predicated on some degree of panic.
And they changed the next day.
And it's, well, yeah, sure. So